All right, so finishing the last bit of chromatography, which is the HPLC. I'll see how far along I can get today. Maybe finish it on Wednesday and then start a new section, which is spectroscopy. All right, so HPLC, this image here was prepared by one former TA of mine. She took all of the student samples and put them in this shape. Isn't that cute? Okay, so originally HPLC stood for high pressure liquid chromatography because the column and the system generated a lot of back pressure. But over the year, they improved the packing of the columns, and with improvement of packing of the columns, smaller particle size, more packed, and then it became not as high of pressure, so the naming, the nomenclature went from high pressure liquid chromatography to high performance. That's a little bit of history about what the P stands for. Started as pressure and now it is more as performance. So if we want to compare high performance liquid chromatography to low pressure liquid chromatography, we already talked about low pressure liquid chromatography in the introduction to chromatography, where we talked about column chromatography. And here we're specifically looking at those pre-packed columns that you saw in the HPLC lab. They are stainless steel, they're pre-packed, they're reusable. And so you can have good resolution in a short period of analysis time. You can reuse the column. If you take good care of it, you can have up to 1,000 injections. But this can be plus or minus. Sometimes your samples are pure, sometimes your samples have contaminants. So you can reuse it up until the column tells you no more. I lost capacity because of losing functional groups or permanently blocked functional groups. So that happens way, takes about, if you use it, let's say 1,000 injection per column, sometimes it can last you up to a year, but sometimes more depending on the type of the sample. Easy sample recovery, that means when you inject, you don't have a lot of losses in the sample. And when you're trying to collect peaks, they are mostly resoluted peaks, and then you can get better collection of samples. There is a YouTube video on HPLC, which I posted on Canvas. It's really cool. I usually show it in class, but we're a little bit behind. I'm not going to show you the video, but do watch it. It's on Canvas. It's very easy to follow and kind of goes through whatever we went through in the lab and today in class, but in a very easy way to follow, basically visual. Okay. So the main components of HPLC, which you already know because of lab, you have your solvent reservoir where you have your solvent, and then the solvent is linked to a pump. And sometimes you have 2 pumps, sometimes you have 4 pumps. It depends on your system. You can have 1 pump, and when you have 1 pump, you can have 2 solvents, but you would have a mixer before the pump. Or if you have 2 pumps, you will have 2 solvents. They get mixed both under pressure, and you have the mixer after the pump. So it really depends on whether your system that you have, you can have what we call low pressure mixing or high pressure mixing, depending where the mixer is located. You already saw the mixer in the lab, a stainless steel compartment where we had 2 solvents that needed to be mixed and gradient developed throughout the run. So they had to be mixed after pumping. So from the pump, your solvent goes through to the injection port. In the injection port, this is where the sample gets injected, and there is a sample loop that the sample is injected in, and then when we're running a sample, valves will open up. I'll show you the picture of valves later. They open up, allowing the mobile phase to go into the sample loop, collect the sample, and then go onto the car. So then your samples or components within the sample go through the column. They get separated based on their interaction with the stationary. When they get separated, then hopefully you have good resolution based on the method, then each one of them will reach the detector separately. You have multiple detectors types. We're going to talk about different detectors. And then you get a signal that will be processed through the software where you get a peak, you get A out of the peak, and then you can do your quantitative or qualitative analysis. Sometimes after passing through the detector, instead of going to the waste here, we can open the valves and allow it to go into a fraction collector. So you will have tubes and the fraction collector will be timed. Every certain time, every 5 minutes or whatever, it will collect sample. And then you can take the sample for further analysis. If you don't have a fraction collector, you can monitor, instead of timing it per time, you can monitor as the peak of interest start coming out. You open the valve and you have a little vial or a tube that you will collect the sample. So the pumps control the flow rate, meaning you can determine, you can enter the flow rate, how many mils per minute you want the flow to be. And the flow rate, as I said before, it controls or it helps with the resolution. Faster flow rate, you reach equilibrium faster and potentially separate better your components and shorten your analysis time. However, too fast of a flow rate, you don't get separation. All of the compounds are moving too fast. You're not allowing them to separate. Too slow of a flow rate, then what happens, you would basically, your components will diffuse into your stationary phase rather than equilibrate in and out into the mobile phase. So with the pumps, you can have either isotropic elution or gradient elution. And we talked about low pressure versus high pressure. Low pressure mixing is when you have one pump, but you want to mix solvents, 2 solvents, 3 or even 4. You can do that and you have a mixer before they get into the pump. So they get mixed really well and then they get pumped into the system. High pressure mixing, meaning you have 2 pumps, 2 solvents. After they're pumped, they're mixed under pressure. So either way can happen. The injector, so either you have an auto injector, which you saw in the lab, where you have potentially trained with up to 50 samples, and you have a needle that comes automatically, goes through the septum, which is the rubber material. It goes in the cover of the tubing. So it goes in, collects a specific volume that you programmed it to, and then goes into the and injects into the sample loop. So you can change the equipment that we have, the old one, you can change the sample loop to different sizes, 20 microliter, 100 microliter, 200 microliters. The newer unit that we have, it's just fixed at 50 microliter, I think 400, don't remember. But anyway, so when the sample is injected, there is an opening where your mobile phase can go and collect the sample. When there is no injection, when you're done with the injection, the valves close and then the mobile phase just bypasses, goes through, but bypasses the sample loop. So this is the same for whether it is an auto injector or a manual injector. You have the sample loop that you can control sometimes the size of it, depending on how much you would like to inject and what capacity your column has. The manual injector you also saw, it's just you have a syringe and then a needle, and then you do manually clean up of the sample loop and the injection port, and then you inject your sample manually. So the difference, why would you, if there is an option of getting an auto injector, why would you go with a manual injection? Yes, Shri? Cheaper. It's very simple. Labs usually prefer auto injector because you can process a lot of sample. You don't have any volume errors. It's constant. If the injector is working properly, you have constant with high precision injection. Manual injector is just a unit that's cheaper. And sometimes you just have to get something cheaper. So in terms of columns, you saw that usually I bring columns to the class, but we did the lab, so we actually saw the column. So it's stainless steel. Usually you have other types of column, but not necessarily stainless steel, but mostly stainless steel with your packing material, especially things packed inside of it, and you can get different sizes of the columns. So different shapes and sizes, so long and thin, short and thick. So you can have analytical type columns and you can have semi-preparatory type columns, which means that you can get bigger columns where you can do good resolution separation with high pressure or high performance liquid chromatography, but at the same time you inject a lot of samples. So if you're trying to collect samples, you prevent having to inject multiple times to get enough quantity. So sometimes you need that semi-preparatory analytical columns for a balance between good resolution, better than low pressure liquid chromatography, and at the same time has a little bit more capacity if you're collecting your sample. The other thing I want to point out is the guard column. And I showed you this little guard column in that we put it between the after the mixer, after the injector, and before it gets on the column. So from its name, it's guarding the column. Can anybody remember what it is guarding the column from? Gretchen? Impurities. So once you prepare your sample, you do filter the sample to get rid of large particulates before injection. But depending on the constituents of the sample, sometimes you have impurities and constituents that might bind to the column very strongly. And if it binds to the column very strongly, it might not come out really well. It's going to block the functional groups and you have poor resolution because of that. So to prevent that from happening, the guard column captures those impurities. And then the rest of the components of the sample will go. So the guard column has materials similar or exactly the same as the material in the column. So the same station you have C18, reverse phase chromatography, then you will have a C18 guard. In gas chromatography, what you did is testing.
So your sampling is a lot of impurities.
Oh, block the flow.
That's something where the filtration effect on that three columns just hindering.
So two things we do to prevent large particulates is, first of all, you filter. And we always filter at 0.45 micrometer. So that basically the size that is okay for samples to be injected on time. So anything bigger, we don't want it to go to block. Block the flow, block the capillary tubes, block everything. So we don't filter. Next thing is, even if the compounds are small, they combine strongly and reduce your capacity of the compound. You don't want that. So the guard column plays this role of capturing the molecules that like to associate like they're going to bind strongly with the column. So the guard column has a capacity as well. That's why we need to change it. So with every column, you get 3 columns on it. And then you would change it every 300 injections. Now, this is kind of the rule of thumb, 300 injections, but the system tells you when the guard column is blocked, is full. It tells you by increasing the pressure. The first thing you're going to check when your pressure goes out, you say, oh, is my guard column blocked? I take out the guard column, put a new one. If the pressure is still high, I think maybe it's the column. I take out the column, bypass the column, and run the system. If the pressure is still high, then my pumps are blocked. So we just walk through and try, the system is going to tell you if there's something wrong, and you start diagnosis after that. So I was saying in GC, they don't have guard column. What they have a long, very long capillary column and very thin diameter that you can actually cut. And you probably did that in the lab. You cut the front of the column. So the front of the column acts kind of a guard column with all the impurities. So you kind of cut it off so that the next round doesn't have to carry that impurity with it. So that's NDC, but you can't cut the HPLC part.
Is GC the only kind of column you can get?
Yeah, because it's capillary, like very thin silica, I think. Yeah, so you can cut it. You cannot cut an HPLC. You can drop an HPLC, just die.
So let's say again, I guess my experience with HPLC in college tour, when you run samples with a high speed detector, it likes to, I guess, block everything.
So it could be a localized issue. The other issue related to that is how much you're loading on the column. Because the column has capacity. So the size of the column and the stationary phase indicate how much you can inject. So if you injecting more than the capacity of the column, then you will have that problem. It's going to bind and then there's a lot of it, and it's just going to go through the entire system because the column is already full. So it's a dilution issue. I would make sure that my sample is diluted and load as much. That's the first thing I would try.
Sure.
Okay, good. There are different types of columns. In HPLC, most of the columns are packed. That means, there is a capillary and there is a packed column. A packed column meaning you don't have, it's not a hollow column. Like in GC, you have capillary, so there's hollow. The stationary phase is around the interior surface of the capillary column. So mostly in HPLC, you have packed columns, either microbore or microcolumns. So microbore meaning the packed column that has an internal diameter of 0.5 to 2.5. You can have smaller diameter columns, you call them microcolumns, or you can have capillary columns. So even in HPLC, you can get a capillary column. Usually this is then you're doing a ultra high performance HPLC. So in this case, you don't care for high concentrated sample. What you care for is short time of analysis and very good separation. So if you remember from what we covered in chromatography, when you have a hollow column like a capillary column, then you have a very thin stationary phase on the interior. So what happens here is that you reach equilibrium very quickly because you don't have a lot of space and pores for the sample component to go in and get lost and then get delayed. And then the peak, you have this longitudinal diffusion, so the peak widens. When you have very little stationary phase, the sample is going to go in and out very quickly. So you get really nice, very sharp, almost like a line, very sharp peaks. You get very nice resolution, very short analysis time, 5 to 10 minutes analysis time. And that would be great for coupling with mass spectrometry for identification purposes. So we do that a lot. Ultra HPLC is mostly for identification purposes and detector linked to MS. Okay. So the advantages of using a smaller diameter column include, which are the following? Smaller diameter, and let's say longer column. All of the above. So when I have low amount of my stationary phase, whether it is packed column or capillary column, I get fast equilibration. Therefore, I get really nice sharp peak. And the peak height will increase, but not necessarily the area. So instead of getting this shape of a peak, you're getting this shape of a peak. So here you have higher sensitivity because you can detect absorption at lower concentration than here, if you're measuring absorption. So you increase your sensitivity, meaning you can detect smaller differences between samples better. So it increases the height, but the area remains the same, whether it is short or long. The area at the end of the day will be the same. And reduce equilibrium time, yes, because you have less material, less stationary phase to go through, and therefore you reach equilibrium faster. So packing material. So the packing of the column can serve like a support, and it can be a support and a stationary phase at the same time, or it can be an inner support with a stationary phase coated around it on the surface of it. Usually it's small particle size, well-defined, so when you pack, you have minimum space between the particles so that you have minimal diffusion, any diffusion. It can withstand mechanical strength because the pressure of the system is going to be relatively high pressure, so you don't want it to break down. And also withstand a range of salt, a range of pH, so you have the chemical stability that it won't dissociate the functional groups. And the smaller the pore size, the better. Of each particle has pores, obviously. So the smaller the pore size, the better, so that you don't get the diffusion in the stationary phase. So you can have a bonded phase, like the one we use in the lab, C18, you have silica, and you have the bonded 18 carbon. So this R group here, the R3 gets derivatized into a long chain of hydrocarbon, like C18, or a charged group, it becomes ion exchange, or it can act as, without having the C18, acts as a normal phase being polar. You can have also an inner core. So the inner core is non-porous, so your sample will not go in the inner core. It just acts as a support. It's not part of the stationary phase, but then you have a thin layer of a stationary phase around it. So that enhances the resolution as well. You have a thin layer, there is no way for the sample to go inside any pores and get delayed and broadening the peak. I think we covered that. The last slide I'll cover before I let you go is that, so here you show the bonded phase we talked about, the inner pore we talked about, and then there are other types of stationary phases where they are microporous. So depending on the polymer that you use, and this is very common in size exclusion and ion exchange as well. So you can, depending on the polymer you use, you can have small pores or large pores. So the difference here is with the size of the molecules you're separating. Are you separating proteins? You need to have very large porous material for the proteins to be able to interact. Are you separate amino acids? Then you just need the ones that give you very small polymer with very small pores. Generally. I think I'll stop here and we'll see you on Wednesday. Oh, sorry, one last comment related to your lab reports. So please give me a minute. This is from Kat. She was grading your first full lab report and noticed many of you have a lot of writing grammatical errors. She was very lenient, she said this time, but she encourages me to use the writing center. This is a writing intensive class, so please read your comments you got from your lab report, and you get 9 days. So the last 2 days before submission, please utilize the writing center if you need it.